Good morning. We're ready to begin our third session this morning. Thank you once again for being here. It gives me great pleasure this morning to introduce our next speaker, Professor Emanuele Colombo from the Department of Catholic Studies at DePaul University. And without any further ado, I shall turn the mic over to him.
Thank you very much. I want to start. So, I'm a historian and I work on Jesuit history, but today I will do something completely different. More a personal experience with the words and with the person of Pope Francis. And I will explain the title, El Nos Primerea, Pope Francis and the Primacy of Jesus. I want to start with Jorge Luis Borges, one of the authors that Francis loves. In one famous passage of Borges, he addressed the drama of the modern man, of contemporary man. Modern man, though acknowledging and respecting Christian values, has lost Christ as a real presence, as a physical presence, with a well-defined face. In the tragic view of Borges, the impossibility of recovering the presence of this face does not reduce the need of modern men to see it. Here is the quotation from Borges. Mankind has lost a face, an irretrievable face, and all had longed to be that pilgrim who in Rome sees the Veronica and murmurs in faith, Lord Jesus, my God. Is this then what your face was like? I want to start with this quotation, and I will go back to this quotation at the end, because I want to address how did Pope Francis answer to this drama of contemporary man, the lack for the concrete face of Jesus. In recent months, I had the good fortune to be invited to the Pope Francis Club, which is, here you have the flyer. There is Pope Francis orbitating in the space, I don't know why. This is an initiative of the Paul students, a group of students. They invited me to read and discuss with them texts by Pope Francis. And for the first time in my, not really long, but average long experience as a teacher, as a professor, students asked me to meet more often. So we were meeting every other week. After the second meeting, they told me, we want to meet every week. It was the first time I was meeting. What's going on? And then what happened in the last few months, I have friends, colleagues from all over the world. Some of them are not in the church. Some of them are far from the church. And there is a sentence in the dialogues, in the discussion, that always comes up. As Pope Francis has said. As Pope Francis has said. One friend, a priest, told me, you know, as Pope Francis has said, is a sentence that you hear a lot in the confession. There are tons of people coming back to the sacraments because they heard something or something happening, looking or listening to this man. Another friend who is a chaplain in a prison told me, you should look how people there, inmates there, talk about Pope Francis. Read him, listen to him. So my point is, what's going on? What is Pope Francis saying? And why his language and his way of communicating is so powerful? And I have 5 points. The first one is longer, so don't be scared. And the first one is about language, the words of Pope Francis' words. A recent study has analyzed the words that Pope Francis has used during the first 7 months of his pontificate to determine the ones he used the most. The one word that predominates is the word Jesus, of course. And the next most more frequently used words are everything and everyone. They counted all the words. And this is, for me, is fascinating. Pope Francis is trying to break, to overcome barriers. Jesus is everywhere and is there for everyone. It is a message that returns every week in the Pope's speeches. And my impression is that these three words together, the connection of these three words, disorient those who had assumed that they really understood what Christianity is, and opens a door for people who thought they were outside the church. Jesus, everyone, everywhere. No matter where you are, no matter who you are, Jesus is for everyone and everywhere. But the Pope is also a great inventor, creator of new words. And my understanding of that is like, the words are not capable to express fully the experience of Christianity. It's like when you have a little glass and you pour water, but the glass is too little, and so the water comes out. And that's the idea of the words. And when I read Pope Francis and when I read these new words, I really have this experience. He's trying to put something more. So, Primerea, my good Argentinian friend told me that this is a sort of street slang of Buenos Aires, Primerea. And what does it mean, Primerea? Come first, to be ahead, to precede. Jesus nos primera. Jesus nos primerea. Jesus is ahead of us, comes first, comes before, precedes us. Now, the fact that there is a street slang word that now is entering into the official documents of the church, is evangelical, is really interesting. The popes want to say something really important. There is no word capable to say how much Jesus is there before. In the Pope's word, God is always a surprise. So you never know where and how you will find it. It's always a surprise. A second example of this Pope's creativity is the way in which he comments his motto, miserando atque eligendo. The Pope is using his motto to say, this is the description of my person. I am a sinner that Jesus looked upon. We already heard this sentence yesterday. But how can you translate this beautiful Latin expression? And the Pope says, I think that the Latin gerund miserando is impossible to translate in both Italian and Spanish. Imagine in English, for me, it's impossible. I like to translate it with another gerund, another word that doesn't exist. It's a beautiful word. Misericordiando, mercy. No, misericordiando is the idea that mercy is going on now, is there. It's not something in the past, it's not something that happened. Misericordia, we should repeat this word a lot, misericordiando. And the third example comes from the interview at Civiltà Cattolica, and here Francis is talking about his prayer. And again, another beautiful, beautiful passage. He's saying, prayer for me is not something abstract. I'm not talking to an abstract entity. I'm talking to a God who is present in my life. In fact, when I pray, I always have in mind, I have in my memory, some facts, something that God operated. That day, with that person, in that parish, something real, something concrete. And he puts that in this way. My prayer is memoriosa. Fantastic, memoriosa, full of memory. This is the quotation. Prayer for me is always memoriosa. A prayer full of memory, of recollection. Even the memory of my own history, of what the Lord has done in His church or in a particular parish. Another feature of his language is that Francis uses, he's good in creating these new words, but he always uses normal, daily life words to make a connection between faith and daily life, normal life. So for instance, when you go to the audience, the wealthy audience, the end of the audience is always the same. Have a good lunch. And, you know, it's a normal thing. But people there, and I've been there many times because sometimes I work in Rome in the archives, people there laugh like you, or it's something interesting because there is a connection between the prayer and the lunch. Everything is sacred for a Christian. Everything can be sacred for a Christian. Another example, he was in Assisi. He was talking to the cloister nuns, and he was saying, what is the evidence that vocation is true? The evidence that vocation is true is joy. If you are joyful, your vocation is true. But then he was saying, be careful, because when I say joy, I don't mean the smile of a flight attendant. Pretty clear, no? Pope Francis speaks with abundance of quotation marks. They counted more than 700 quotation marks only in the first 7 months of his pontificate. And there is a pretty clear structure in the way in which he talks. He asks questions, first of all, to himself. Think about all his, more or less all his audiences has this structure. Who is Jesus? First. Who is Jesus for me? Second. And what is Jesus asking of me? These 3 steps. The first one is usually a quotation from the Gospel, who is Jesus. In the second step, he's comparing this quotation of the Gospel to his own experience. When I was young, my grandmother, or yesterday I met a person on the street, yesterday I read this news on the newspaper. And the third is, what is Jesus asking of us? What should we change? What is conversion? And this structure is beautiful and powerful for everyone, because you see him doing these 3 steps, walking these 3 steps. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus for me? And what should I change of my life? There are 2 words that are always repeated by Pope Francis: mercy and tenderness. They are repeated many times in his speeches. And mercy, I want to start with mercy. Mercy was a word dear to John Paul II, very dear to John Paul II, that Pope Francis is using to say the Lord is never tired of forgiving, and on the contrary, sometimes we get tired of asking for forgiveness. Mercy. And I just read this quotation. It comes from one of the angels. One day, the Pope is talking about his life in Argentina. One day, an elderly woman approached me, humble, very humble. She was over 80 years old. I looked at her and I said, Grandma, because in our country, that is how we address the elderly. Grandma, do you want to make your confession? Yes, she said to me. But if you have not sinned, and she said to me, we all have sinned. But perhaps the Lord does not forgive them. The Lord forgives all things, she said to me with conviction. But how do you know, Grandma? If the Lord did not forgive everything, the world would not exist. I felt an urge to ask her, tell me, Grandma, did you study at the Gregorian University? because that is the wisdom which the Holy Spirit gives. Inner wisdom, focus on God's mercy. Let us not forget this word. God never ever tires of forgiving us. And since God's mercy is so important, the church has to be a constant sign of God's mercy, like a field hospital, as we said yesterday. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal his wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. Heal the wounds, heal the wounds. And then tenderness. Tenderness is the way in which Pope Francis usually represents God and Jesus as the Father with the children, the Father with the kids. When God meets us, he tells us two things. The first thing he says is have hope. God always opens doors. He never closes them. He is the Father who opens doors for us. The second thing he says is don't be afraid of tenderness. Now, if words are so important, are so decisive for describing the Christian experience, the Christian life, who are the first ones who should use this new language of mercy and tenderness? Who are the first ones? Priests. And I was surprised to find a long and detailed section in the Evangelii about how to prepare an homily. Really long, a few pages with all the details. And here, Pope Francis is saying something interesting. The homily is the touchstone for judging a pastor's closeness and ability to communicate to his people. I had the impression that he was talking about his way of speaking, of course, his way of communicating. The goal, the Pope says, is to communicate with words that set hearts on fire. To proclaim a synthesis, not ideas or detached values. And there is a powerful statement that Francis tells every priest. I really love it. Where your synthesis is, there lies your heart. What do you care about? What's the point? Where your synthesis here is, there lies your heart. The Pope is challenging the humanity of the priest and not the professional preacher. So those who preach have to be first of all penetrated by the word which will also penetrate others. And this is the suggestion. In the presence of God, during a recollected reading of the text, it is good to ask, for example, Lord, what does this text say to me? What is it about my life that you want to change by this text? What troubles me about this text? Why am I not interested in this? Or perhaps, what do I find pleasant in this text? It's clear that if you don't do this for yourself, you cannot suggest this to other priests. This is the way in which he's comparing the text with his life. The last observation about Pope Francis' language is the fact that he has said, in a very clear way, I think, that he's not accustomed to addressing so many people all at once. In the interview at Civiltà Cattolica, he said, I can look at individual persons, one at a time, to come into contact in a personal way with the person that I have before me. Which is strange for a Pope who speaks to millions of people. I am not used to the masses. I was thinking, if we look back to 1 year of pontificate, what is in my memory? In my memory there are moments, events, occasions, in which he was talking with one person. A phone call, a letter, a gesture, and those little things, those little gestures, were capable to change the perception of Christianity all over the world. And I will give an example at the end. So talking about this personal relationship, I want to go to the second point, that is the gestures of the Pope. Those who have had the chance to attend the Wesleyan audience in St. Peter's Square are probably aware of the disproportion between the brevity of what he says and the time he dedicates to gestures. Hugs, caresses, shaking the hands of the pilgrims on the first row, embracing the sick, and kissing the babies. the importance of a physical connection, I want to stress this point, is always at play in the way the Pope relates to the people. He said, I become fearful when Christians lose the ability to embrace and extend a loving caress to others. And there is one of his recommendations that became famous. Sometimes I ask a person, do you give alms? They say, yes, Father. And when you give alms, do you look at the eyes of the people to whom you give alms? Oh, I don't know, I wasn't thinking about that. Then you didn't meet him. You tossed the alms and left. When you give alms, do you touch the hand of the needy person? Or do you just toss a coin to him? No, you tossed the coin. And you didn't touch him? If you didn't touch him, you didn't meet with him. So these words don't sound strange or exaggerated when watching it, looking at him. The way in which this touching, this physical contact is normal in his life. During a meeting with the poor clerics in Assisi, the cloister nuns in Assisi, the Pope told the nuns with great irony that they should not be too spiritual. Explaining in this way, this is your path, not too spiritual. When I meet nuns who are too spiritual, I always think of the foundress of the monasteries of your rivals, Santa Teresa of Avila. When one of her nuns came to her with strange spiritual thoughts, she said to the cook, give her a steak. It's great. The third point is entitled, change what is more in order to change what is big. Because one of the questions we always hear about Pope Francis, even in this conference, is when this revolution will happen? How long must we wait to see the great changes promised or perhaps imagined after this election? I think that Francis answered this question many times, just describing his modus operandi, his method. This is my method, this is my methodology. Is what the Pope calls discernment, and we had a great talk yesterday by Professor Bernardi about that. The discernment takes time, I'm quoting. For example, many people think that changes and reforms can take place in short time. I believe that we always need time to lay the foundation for real, effective change. My choices, including those related to day-to-day aspects of life, like the use of a modest car, are related to a spiritual discernment that responds to a need that arises from looking at things, at people, and from reading the signs of the times. Discernment in the Lord guides me in my way of governing the church. And the fact that many people remember these little things, remember the shoes, remember the attire, remember the car, remember the room, remember the elimination of the barrier between the Pope and the people, is a sign not only that people like to chat and to do gossip, it's also a sign that those little things are going to the point. But not only of the church and the structure of the church, I'm going to the point of people, of the need for conversion of each one of us. This emphasis on little things that can change great things can be seen in this recent statement. This comes from the beautiful interview at La Stampa. A few months ago, an elderly cardinal said to me, "You have already started a renewal, a reformation of the Curia with your daily masses in Santa Marta's house." This made me think, reform always begins with spiritual and pastoral initiatives before structural changes. And on these daily masses, I have to say that if you go around and you talk to people, you can see how influential this normal idea, let's open the doors of the daily mass of the Pope, and let's spread around the 3 minutes and a half homily he's giving every day, is really influencing a lot the way in which people think. Because the Pope talk about everything, talk about relationship between faith and economics, politics, something that happened somewhere in the world. An episode he's really struck by. So I would call this a school of faith with no tuition. You can just read it. And if you look how many people have on their iPad the Pope app, in which you can read every day these 10, 15 lines with what the Pope is saying, what the Pope is telling. The fourth point, a church that goes out. Actually, I was in Rome in December with my colleague, Dr. Kavanagh, and with 18 DePaul students, most of them non-Christian without a Christian formation. And I was lecturing my class on Jesuit missions in the 17th century, and I realized that the problem was not the 17th century, the problem were not Jesuits, the problem was mission. They couldn't at all understand why a person should go, risking his own life, to meet people who never invited him to talk about Jesus. It's not enough to respect your belief. It's not enough to respect everyone and to keep your belief. And of course, those are great questions. I think it was great for us to be there and to try to answer. But it's also the sign of a sort of amnesia that's entering into the church. The idea that mission is not necessary, the idea that politically correct is the only attitude, the idea that religion is a private matter. Now, of course, the challenge of the Pope is amazing on this point. Is underlining that mission is not a feature for courageous people. You are good, you are brave, you can go to mission. He's basically saying there is no faith without mission. Mission is a dimension of faith. At the meeting with the ecclesial movements, he made this point very clear. When the church is closed, she falls sick. She falls sick. Think of a room that has been closed for a year. When you go into it there is a smell of the damp. Many things are wrong with it. A church closed in on herself is the same. It's a sick church. The church must step outside herself. To go where? To the outskirts of existence, whatever they may be. But she must step out. But what happens if we step outside ourselves? The same as can happen to anyone who comes out of the house and onto the street. An accident. But I tell you, I prefer a church that has had a few accidents to a church that has fallen sick from being closed. Go out. Go out. And in the interview, there is one of the statements that for me and also for the students of this Pope Francis class was really important. We started to what does it mean for our life. He said, we must not focus on occupying the spaces where power is exercising, but rather on starting long-run historical processes. Again, he was saying we should abandon the temptation of domesticating the frontiers and bringing them home. You have to live on the border and be audacious. The last point is called From the Heart of the Gospel, and concerns the content of what the Pope is communicating, the aspect of Christian doctrine he is emphasizing. I think that this is a delicate matter because the preaching of Pope Francis has been the subject of much distortion. He is referred to as the Pope of the poor, the Pope who renounces privileges, the Pope of dialogue, and I think that all of these descriptions are true, but they must be placed within the great context of the Catholic faith if they are to be understood. And here there is a section in Evangelii Gaudium, I think that the Evangelii Gaudium should be read more, where Pope Francis addresses this question of how to speak about Christianity. And he insists that one should not stress secondary factors as if they were the entire story, perhaps giving in to the temptation of privileging aspects of Christianity that happen to fit with one's own preferences, particular concerns, or sensibility. When we adopt a pastoral goal and the missionary style, this is a quotation, which would actually reach everyone without exception or exclusion, the message has to concentrate on the essentials, on what is most beautiful, most grand, most appealing, and at the same time most necessary. And for me, this is a great idea. What is most necessary is also what is most beautiful and fascinating. There is a coincidence. And Pope Francis is saying in Evangelicalium what is the core of Christian belief, of Christian doctrine. What is this essential? The beauty of the saving love of God made manifest in Jesus Christ, who died and rose from the dead, and faith working through love. And I like the way in which, from these 2 points, he's building or Evangelicalium. The last quotation, proclamation in a missionary style focuses on the essentials, on the necessary things. This is also what fascinates and attracts more, what makes the heart burn, as it did for the disciple of Emmaus. My conclusion. One of the gestures that has left the world literally without words, and I'm talking about secular magazines, secular television, everywhere people were talking about that. And in the presentation by Professor Bernardi, there was the same episode, is Pope Francis' embrace of Vinicio, the man whose body has been disfigured by a grave illness. Now, I could have saved you 30 minutes because in this gesture we can find all the aspects of Francis' way of communicating, if you think about that. Paying attention to a single man turns into a communication to the whole world. The Christian embrace is physical. Imagine the same thing with the blessing from the altar, completely different, another word. A small gesture can change little things to change great things. The tenderness of a man that make you think about the tenderness of God. The focus on the core of Christian message, the beauty of the news about Jesus that become charity. Now, with this gesture, and I want to conclude in this way, with this gesture, Pope Francis embraced a man's pain and revealed the meaning of sorrow, of pain. And I want to quote again a passage of the marvelous interview at La Stampa. One man who has been a life mentor for me is Dostoevsky. And this explicit and implicit question, why do children suffer? This question has always gone around in my heart. There is no explanation. This image comes to mind. At a particular point of his or her life, a child wakes up, doesn't understand much and feels threatened. He or she starts asking their mom questions, many questions. This is the why age. But when the child asks a question, he or she doesn't wait to hear the full answer. They immediately start bombarding you with more whys. What they are really looking for, more than an explanation, is a reassuring look on their parents' face. When I come across a suffering child, the only prayer that comes to mind is the why prayer. Why, Lord? It doesn't explain anything to me, but I can feel him looking at me. So I can say, you know why? I don't, and you won't tell me. But you are looking at me, and I trust you, Lord. I trust your gaze. So I trust your gaze, and I want to conclude going back to Jorge Luis Borges' quotation. Human beings are looking for the face of Jesus, the concrete face of Jesus. They respect Christian values, but they have lost the face of Jesus. We should not be surprised, I think, if St. Peter's Square continues to be more crowded than ever. Perhaps we should not be amazed because, as Bob has said, everyone who would like to be a pilgrim in Rome, who is able to ask with sincerity, Christ Jesus, true God, is this your face? Thank you.
Thank you all, Professor Colombo. We'll now take questions. We'll answer them one at a time. Thank you.
Now you know why I sit up front. I can get here quicker. Thank you so much. The ability to make a synthesis. It seems to me that Francis is a living synthesis, you know. And just one little example would be, and see, I wonder if you would agree with this. Many years ago, I read a study about the Church's approach to morality, and it tried to demonstrate that over history there have been different things that have attracted moralists and preachers. And there was a shift at a certain moment in history from issues that had to do with, let's say, usury as a great evil, looking at usury, charging interest and so forth, to matters of sexuality. Okay? Actually around the 16th century, something in there. Some people have been, they've wondered why Pope Francis really is not that interested in matters, as some have put it, from the waist down. Okay? You know, and it has to do with, you know, matters about contraception or some of these things. But anyway, is that the result of a change, maybe? Is there a change taking place with this synthesis approach that he's bringing that will get us to focus more on the essentials? You know, because certainly, as a person that's worked a little bit in spiritual direction, one of the things that we see is that, you know, matters that have to do with sexuality are significant and important in life, but they often can become, we can become obsessed with them, and we just have to move on, you know. But anyway.
Yeah, but just two words. I think that this idea of the essential, there is a hierarchy from the heart of the gospel, is well explained by the idea. If you are a field hospital, the first thing you need to do is to heal wounds. The first thing you need to do is to communicate that Christ is a real presence, because all the rest comes as a consequence. And I don't think he doesn't care about the consequences. I think he cares. But let's put it this way: who cannot be fascinated by the value of life, looking at the way in which he's treating, from the kids to the sick to death? Who cannot start looking at the value of life, the respect for life, starting from that? Isn't that the most powerful way to start the conversation? Is not that the most powerful way to call people to move, to convert? That's my impression. And the synthesis is really one of his strengths, also in the way in which he speaks.
You started off with this reference to the street language coming into church doctrine. In your comparative perspective, have you come across anything like this ever before? This sort of radical change?
I mean, for sure not like that, but then, you know, there are experts more than myself in this room, for sure not. I mean, I study 16th and 17th century church history, and at that time for sure not. But let's say there is this idea of the importance of the word in order to communicate an experience has always been part of the tradition of the church. I was teaching 2 days ago. I was lecturing and discussing with my students the first missions to China, Jesuit mission to China. And there you can see the use of the words in order to communicate an experience. Maybe sometimes those words were not perfect in terms of dogma, but it was the only way to communicate the experience of Christianity. And there were huge debates about it. Here is a new way to do the same thing. To use a word that now people like saying, my prayer is memoriosa, which is not only the word. If you remember the word, you start praying in a different way. So the power of the words has always been there. This way, I think, is pretty new, at least for what I know.
Thank you, Emanuele, for this beautiful and moving presentation. Very, very moving and beautiful, too. I have the impression, following Pope Francis during this first year of pontificate, that nothing he says or he doesn't have an intention. It's nothing is in vain. Nothing is without thinking about it. I think you took a point of the discernment. It's very important. Everything is discerned. But do you have also this impression? I think that the shoes he puts on, the bag he carries himself, the car he refuses and the car he adopts, everything is a message. I would like to know if you agree with that.
I don't have, I don't know much more than what everyone knows. So again, there are probably people in this room that know more. But my impression is that he doesn't start calculating the effect of an action, but he starts from his own life. He used to do this. He's still doing this. He used to go with public transportation. He wants to keep going on the same bus of the cardinals and not with a different. I don't have the impression that he's thinking, maybe that if I do this, I communicate this. But he's starting from something that is part of his life. Of course, what happens is that those things are becoming a great provocation, a great challenge to everyone. Absolutely.
It's been my experience that very often people outside the church recognize something in popes that people inside the church are a little slow to recognize. I have a question, but I just want to give it an example. Two of them, actually. It was Billy Graham, to his great surprise, who watched John Paul II come out on the balcony when he was first being introduced and said, Christ is the answer. And Billy said to himself, my God, this guy's an evangelist, just like me. And it turned out he was. He certainly saw it before an awful lot of people, myself included. The other is that the other day, the editor-in-chief and founder of Sojourners, whose name I forgot.
Wallace.
Yeah, Wallace had a wonderful essay in which he said, why are we responding to this Pope? Because he models Jesus. Now, forgive him for using a noun as a verb, but we've been doing that. But he's right, it seems to me. So my question to you is, have you heard any responses from people of that sort who are not Roman Catholic who have responded to them? Because that would tell you something too, it seems to me, about the universality of these gestures and these words that you talk about.
Yeah, in Europe, most of the scholars in church history, I don't know why. I mean, I know why. This is another topic. Are really against the church, and sometimes strongly against the church. And so I had many conversations and sometimes fights, and it's fascinating. The most common idea, expression that I've heard is, he's opening the door. He's opening the door to me. This is said in different ways. This Pope is opening the door. People with Catholic education then abandon the church. He's opening the door. That's for the way in which he talks, for the way in which he's talking about the beauty of the gospel. He's opening the door. This is what I heard from them. And one of them told, I'm thinking to go back to the church, and he was saying that like a strange thought, very. Yeah, I mean, it's possible. Do that.
I just read yesterday that the woman who's featured in the film Philomena had just met with the Pope, and she made this remarkable statement afterwards that she felt a sense of forgiveness that had eluded her for 50 years. This is tongue-in-cheek. What is it about mate, tea, that enables the encounters that the Pope has had?
So, sorry. What's your question? It's not a question.
Tongue-in-cheek, it's often said that the Pope drinks the mate, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah.
The mate tea. That seems to be a staple of his ministry in Argentina. When he would meet with people, he sits down and has mate. What is it about mate? I've never had it. So
Over lunch we can talk about matters. Yeah.
Here's a question that I reveal more of my own ignorance, but using kind of caricatures and stereotypes, we've kind of encountered Pope John Paul, from the standpoint of his great strength as a philosopher, and Pope Benedict, of course, a very erudite theologian and a person of great depth in that area. When I reflect on my own experience or encounter with Francis, and you touched upon it in a couple of names, I think of someone who's steeped in human story, and I think more of literature. And so you mentioned Borges or Dostoevsky. And I was wondering if you could elaborate further on maybe those literary influences, or there's ways that we could perhaps understand the world of Pope Francis through maybe his own fascination or encounter with literature and poets.
Yeah, in the interview at Civiltà Cattolica, there is a list of, at least part of the authors he liked. He loved and he's reading. I was impressed by the fact that he read twice. He said, I'm reading again Manzoni, Promessi Sposi. How do you translate Promessi Sposi? Can you say it louder? Perfect. So he's reading again. There is a list of authors, literature, music, and the thing is that, again, I just have the same documents you have, but when we discussed the interview with the students, we started to be curious about all these authors that he was mentioning, that of course students didn't know the names and so didn't know anything about them, and some of them started to read and say, oh, I want to be closer to Pope Francis, I want to understand why he's reading this or that. For sure, the way in which he talks about literature and music makes clear that those cultural things had a great influence in the way in which he's thinking and talking and speaking. This is my impression. And there is also a beautiful episode on the way in which he was teaching literature on the same interview.
How about the Consul of Argentina explaining mate?
Sure, please.
Okay, mate is a drink. Mate is a drink that is coming from indigenous people. It's
If you can go over there because we're streaming. So from
The entire world wants to know what mate is. So.
Thank you. Mate is a traditional drink that comes out of herbs, indigenous herbs that are dry under the sun and then used as an infusion. But the most important thing that I believe is related to the question asked is that you drink mate collectively. You pour hot water into these herbs, you have a straw, and you drink out of the straw, passing it around. So it's a very social and a nice traditional means of relating in Argentina. You will not find people, I mean, many people will be reluctant to share the straw with people you don't know, but usually an Argentinian will be very open and taking care of like this nice gesture of being offered a mate, you will drink the mate. So that has a meaning that may be also related to his fantastic behavior.
And it's also quite serendipitous that we have the Consul of Argentina, Mr. Suarez, here with us. Thank you.
I wanted to ask about joy, about the exhortation, because it seems like it's very challenging because and it seems to fit with this focus on the essential, because he seems to be focusing on, let's say, the end result of Christian experience or Christian invitation. And he's saying this at the same time that he's saying we're like a field hospital, and it's difficult sometimes to understand what joy would be in the context of a field hospital and all the problems and this imagery we would associate with that. Can you say something about what he means by joy and how he can both propose this and the same kind of urgency that he brings to the, let's say the problem off the coast of Italy with all the people that drowned and things like that. So this the seeming contradiction between the field hospital, the church that responds urgently to needs, and the joy as the heart of the exhortation.
Yeah, there is a quotation I forgot to read in Evangelicalion, in which he says that there are Christians who live Lent without Easter. And he's just opening this idea of the joy of the gospel. Living Lent without Easter is pretty... This is my understanding. In reading him and in looking at him, the joy he's talking about, and when he says it's not the joy of the flight system, he's talking about hope, a deep joy. A joy that can be together with sorrow, together with suffering. When he went to Lampedusa, first of all, the gesture itself was something that, for Italy, but I would say for the world, was something huge. The way in which he went there, because of what happened there. And he was talking about suffering as something that doesn't eliminate the possibility of hope, of a deep joy. And there is an entire section on Evangelii Gaudium explaining what does it mean, how can a Christian be joyful even in a sorrowful situation. The last word, let's say in this way, the last word is not sorrow. The last word is not death. The last word is not sickness. He's trying to communicate that with words, with gestures, with the way in which he lives. And at the same time, he's not saying, he's really challenging everyone to say, this doesn't mean that we do not care about those situations. There is a fantastic passage in Evangelii Gaudium talking about the poor, saying, sometimes academics, people in business, think that they have a different mission because they are important, they are educating people, they are doing great things, they are running Catholic studies departments. They think that they should not have to do directly with the poor people because they are going on with their mission in a different way. He said, that's not true. That's a great excuse. Go there where there is suffering. Look at suffering. Bring what you have to bring with suffering. I think that following Pope Francis, I want just to give you the last quotation that I forgot. Have a good lunch.
Professor Colombo just made my job a lot easier. We're breaking for lunch now. We'll resume at 1:30. Thank you very much.